Mention equity to an American, and they might ask you how long you've been a member of the Democratic Socialists of America, and whether you are a race and gender or otherwise communist. This is because equity across the Atlantic has a very different meaning than it has within Europe. Across the Atlantic, it refers to the sort of complete equality where no one can be any different than anyone else. The sort of North Korean, everyone wears the same suit to work every day sort of thing. Where while I might not be able to run as fast as Usain Bolt, we should be considered as running just as fast, and maybe his leg should be cut off so that I can run the same speed. And as I might not be able to jump as high as Michael Jordan, the same sort of problem might emerge. So it's in America, it has a deep ideological tinge, and you sometimes even see British commentators sort of approach the word equity in that approach, and sometimes it's meant that way. And when things are imported from America, it often does have that sort of meaning. Within England, the Equality Act and its requirements refer to equality, not to equity. And equality, even within America, will be understood as the sort of the fact that we are all equal under the law, rather than we must all be made exactingly equal, like communism promises, but never really delivers, because we all have that thing we're better at and those things we're worse at. And that's why we have a society in the first place, because I might not be very good at certain tasks. Therefore, I pay someone else to do those tasks for me, whether it's growing my food or killing my food or whatever else it might be. Those are not my areas of speciality. And because we're all different, we can never be all equal in that sort of ideological sense. Karl Marx simply didn't know what he was talking about. But equity across the Atlantic, this side of the pond, has a very different meaning. And on the British and Irish Isles, especially within English law, it has a fascinating sort of meaning. It refers to a sort of gross legal system, which doesn't necessarily apply to any matter where it is applicable. A judge in a court which is deciding things as a court of equity is able to decide it based on discretion. It can decide, I'm going to grant this or I'm not. And it's not necessarily bound by past decisions of courts of equity in the same way that a common law court is. You see, the English common law binds future courts to follow it unless there's reasons for them not to, or else unless it's a higher court and so forth. But it brings a lot of certainty to law, and certainty is a good thing. But sometimes certainty is a bad thing as well. I'm sure you've had trouble with some sort of tech product, and you've called the help center and spent 5 hours on the phone waiting to speak to a person to assist you. And then they do something or other on their computer, and everything gets fixed in a way that just wasn't possible using the ordinary tools available for you to be able to fix whatever it is, whether your email or something else. They made an exception for you. And that sort of exception is very much like the law of equity. Now, equity has certain rules to it. For instance, you need to approach it with clean hands, you need to approach it in haste, and so forth. But it's one of the more fascinating aspects of English law, and it is an alternative to the common law and its certainty. For instance, let's say that Joe the nobleman goes off to fight in the Crusades to chase the caliphate back from certain European countries. And he does very well in the Crusades. But before he goes crusading, he signs over his lands to John, his cousin, in order to take care of him while he is out fighting for the King of England. When he returns, John says, no, these are now my lands. Go away, Joe. And Joe approaches the king and says, listen, I only signed over these lands so that my cousin could look after them. They actually are my land. They're not his. They might be de jure his, in law his, but they're de facto mine. And the king looks at it and he thinks, you know what, it actually does belong to this nobleman who went out to fight the Crusades. It actually is his land. And so you have the law of trust, the law that the person who owns the land in law is not the person who actually owns the land. And that's something you can get from equity. That's equitable law. And later on, the king handed it over to his Lord Chancellor, who would adhere to giving equitable solutions. And then it went to courts of equity. And later, the courts of common law and the courts of equity were combined within the UK legal system, so that an ordinary court can give an equitable solution, acting as a court of equity. And that's quite important. Something like an injunction, what in Roman Dutch law you call an interdict, an order ordering someone to do something or not to do something, is something which you get from equity. And it's very useful to have these sorts of solutions. It's very useful to have the law of trust. For instance, you can register 4 owners of property in the British Land Registry, the English one. But anyone after that is someone who owns the land in trust, not actually owning it as a registered owner. They own it through the registered owners, and there's all sorts of processes involved to make sure that they get what is theirs. If, for instance, you help someone buy land and they purchase it and it's in their name, you might be an equitable owner of part of the land due to you actually spending money to assist their purchase. So equity is very useful. It's a sort of legal system which needs to be there, but if it were always there, it could cause some problems. And that's where the common law with its certainty is very important, but equity with its exceptions to that certainty is also quite important. It's a bit like the concept of law versus the concept of mercy. And both of these concepts obviously had their roots in the king, who is able to use force to create law for his subjects and to create certainty, which is very important, but also to create the exceptions. And those exceptions, in the case of the law of equity, can continue on for hundreds and hundreds of years, to an extent that they create their own ghost legal system, so to speak, the law of equity. And while equity in the sort of ideological sense might be seen as forcing everyone to be the same size of block within the stack of blocks, within the British legal system, it refers to practically looking at the situation on the ground and doing what is overall fair and right involving a matter, or at least what the law would consider fair and right, based on what's really happening and what's really on the ground, even if the law isn't necessarily there. And this sort of safety net, this type of catch-all, this sort of equivalent of a presidential pardon in some countries, is incredibly important. It's the sort of thing which turns law from something which is hard steel grinding against hard steel into something which can be fairer for the ordinary man who might not necessarily, in fact, be able to have his real rights protected from ordinary common law decisions. Nothing in this video is legal advice. For that, please see your solicitor.